There is a story so old that no one alive can say exactly when it began. It existed before paper, before ink, before the first alphabet was scratched into clay. It was told around fires, passed from mouth to mouth across generations, carried by sailors across the Mediterranean and merchants across mountain passes and soldiers into lands they had never seen. And everywhere it went, people believed it. Not as metaphor, not as entertainment, as history. As something that had actually happened in real places to a real man not so long ago. The story is about a man named Hercules, and before we go any further, I want you to set aside everything you think you know about him. Forget the Disney movie, forget the marble statues, forget the idea of him as a cartoon strongman in a lion skin. Because the original Hercules, the one the ancient Greeks called Heracles, was something far stranger and more human and more disturbing than any of those images suggest. He was a man who committed terrible acts and then spent the rest of his life trying to atone for them. He was a man who walked into places where no sane person would follow and came back alive. He was a man whose story, when you look at it carefully, does not read like pure invention. It reads like something built around a kernel of truth, a real person, a real time, a real world that was wilder and more dangerous than anything we live in today. Tonight, we are going to go through all 12 of his labors, one by one, and for each one we are going to ask the same question. What if this was not just a myth? What if the monster was real? Not supernatural, not magical, but a real animal or a real place or a real human threat that a real man actually faced. Because the ancient world was not the safe, mapped, understood world we inhabit. It was a place full of creatures we have since hunted to extinction, diseases we no longer remember, landscapes that have since been drained and cleared and civilized out of existence. A lion in ancient Greece was not a metaphor. It was a lion. And lions, as it turns out, are terrifying enough without adding any magic to them at all. The Greeks themselves did not treat these stories as fairy tales. They pointed to specific locations. The swamp where the Hydra lived still exists. The lake at Lerna is a real place in the Peloponnese that you can visit today. The island of Crete is real. The region of Thrace is real. The pillars that mark the edge of Hercules' world still stand. Or at least, the strait they refer to still connects the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. These were not vague, legendary lands beyond the edge of the map. They were specific, nameable, visitable places that ancient Greeks knew and traveled to. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Why would you anchor a pure fantasy in places so real and so specific? Why not set your myth in some vague, magical realm? Why bother with the geography at all? Unless the geography mattered. Unless it was pointing at something that had actually happened there. Historians and archaeologists have spent decades asking exactly this question. And what they have found is genuinely interesting. Because myth, especially ancient myth, often functions as a kind of compressed history. A real event happens. It gets retold. With each retelling, it grows a little. The details sharpen into drama. The human actors become larger than life. The animals become monsters. 100 years later, the event is unrecognizable as history. But the bones of it are still there if you know how to look. The real geography, the real creatures, the real dangers of a real time and place. So tonight, we are going to look for the bones. We are going to peel back the mythology and see what might be underneath. And I think you will find, as I did when I started researching this, that what is underneath is somehow more fascinating than the myth itself. Because the myth says a demigod killed a monster. But history might be saying something quieter and stranger and more true. That a man, just a man, went into the wilderness at the edge of the known world and faced things that would have destroyed anyone else, and somehow came back. Again and again and again, 12 times, until the debt was paid. Let us begin. The first labor begins in the region of Nemean, a small valley in the northeastern Peloponnese, the peninsula that makes up the southern part of what we now call Greece. Today, it is a quiet place. There are vineyards and olive groves, and the ruins of a temple to Zeus that you can walk through on a warm afternoon. But in the time of Hercules, which most historians place somewhere around the late Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, Nemean was a place people avoided. And the reason they avoided it had a name: the Nemean lion. The story goes like this. A lion had been terrorizing the region around Nemean for years. Not just killing livestock, which would have been bad enough, but killing people. Hunters who went after it did not come back. The villages around the valley had essentially been emptied. People had fled or died, and the land had been abandoned to this animal. King Eurystheus, the man who had been given authority over Hercules by the gods, sent Hercules to deal with it. Kill the lion, bring back its skin. Simple enough on the surface, except that the myth adds a detail that immediately separates this lion from any ordinary predator. Its hide, the story says, was impenetrable. No weapon could pierce it. Arrows bounced off. Swords could not cut it. The lion was effectively armored. Hercules went to Nemean. He found the lion's den, a cave with 2 entrances. He blocked one entrance and went in through the other. And because his weapons were useless against the creature, he did what no hunter before him had been willing to do. He wrestled it with his bare hands. He grabbed the lion around the neck and strangled it. And then, in a detail the myths always emphasize, he used the lion's own claws to skin it, because nothing else was sharp enough to cut through the hide. From that point on, he wore the skin as armor, which protected him throughout the rest of his labors. Now, let us ask the question, was there a real lion in Nemean? The answer is almost certainly yes. Lions were not mythical creatures in ancient Greece. They were real animals that lived in the wild in that part of the world well into historical times. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, mentions lions living in Macedonia and Thrace. Aristotle, writing a century later, also notes that lions existed in parts of Greece in his time. Cave paintings and ancient artwork from the region depict lions that are clearly based on direct observation, not imagination. These were not the same lions as modern African lions. They were a subspecies now called the Eurasian cave lion or the European lion, and they were apparently somewhat larger and possibly more aggressive than their African cousins. They have since been hunted to complete extinction, the last ones disappearing from Europe sometime around 2,000 years ago. But in the Bronze Age, they were very much present, and a large male lion defending a territory in a region like Nemean would absolutely have been capable of the kind of sustained predation the myth describes. But what about the impenetrable hide? What are we supposed to do with that detail? This is where it gets interesting, because there is a condition that occurs in lions, documented by veterinary science, called leontiasis ossea. It is an abnormal bone growth that can cause the skull and facial bones to thicken dramatically. There are also records of unusually old or scarred lions whose hides, through repeated injury and the resulting buildup of scar tissue, become notably tougher than those of younger animals. An ancient hunter, facing a lion whose hide seemed to deflect or absorb blows in a way that other animals did not, might very plausibly have concluded that the creature was supernaturally protected, especially if multiple attempts to kill it with conventional weapons had failed. And then there is the cave. The myth specifies that the lion lived in a cave with 2 entrances. This is a real and notable detail, because it is not the kind of thing you invent for dramatic effect. It is the kind of thing you remember because it was tactically significant. A lion denning in a 2-entrance cave is significantly more dangerous than one in a single-entrance cave, because you cannot simply block the exit and smoke it out. You have to go in. Someone who actually hunted and killed a lion in exactly that kind of location would remember the 2 entrances, would tell people about them, would pass that detail down, because it was important to understanding how the thing was done. Historians who study the Hercules myth as compressed history often point to the Nemean lion as the clearest example of a real event becoming mythologized over time. A real man, perhaps a famous warrior or regional hero, killed a real lion that had been terrorizing a real valley. The lion was old and battle-scarred and harder to kill than most. The hunter killed it with his hands, or perhaps with a weapon that the retelling later stripped away in favor of something more dramatic. He wore its skin afterward, as hunters did, as a trophy and as practical protection. And over the next few centuries, as the story was retold and expanded, the lion became a monster, the man became a demigod, and a remarkable but fundamentally human achievement became the stuff of legend. The skin, by the way, remained with Hercules through all 12 labours. In every depiction of him from ancient Greece and Rome, he is wearing it. The lion's head serving as a kind of hood, the paws hanging down over his shoulders. It became his defining image. Which is interesting if you think about it from a historical angle, because wearing the hide of a dangerous animal you have killed personally is a real practice with a real psychological logic. It announces something about you to everyone who sees it. It says, I went somewhere most people would not go, faced something most people could not face, and I came back. The lion's skin is not just armor, it is a statement. And the fact that it became the single most recognizable symbol of Hercules across all of ancient Mediterranean culture suggests that this detail, the hide, the proof of the kill, may be one of the oldest and most faithfully preserved elements of the original story. The second labour takes us south, deeper into the Peloponnese, to a place called Lerna. And unlike some of the locations in these stories, Lerna is not vague or symbolic or hard to find on a map. It is a real place. It exists today. You can drive there. It sits on the eastern coast of the Argolid Peninsula, where a series of freshwater springs bubble up from the ground and drain into a shallow, marshy lake before emptying into the sea. The ancient Greeks knew it well. They wrote about it specifically, and they were, almost universally, afraid of it. The fear was not irrational. Lerna in the ancient world was a swamp, a deep, dense, genuinely dangerous swamp fed by those underground springs. And swamps in the ancient Mediterranean were not the relatively benign wetlands we think of today. They were places of disease and decay and unpredictable danger. The miasma, the bad air that rose from stagnant water, was understood even then to cause illness, though the Greeks did not know about mosquitoes and the malaria they carried. What they knew was that people who spent time in places like Lerna got sick and died in ways that people in drier, cleaner environments did not. The swamp was hostile to human life in ways that were real and measurable, even if the mechanism was not understood. Into this swamp, Hercules was sent to kill the Hydra. The Hydra was a water serpent. That much is consistent across all versions of the myth. But it was not an ordinary serpent. It had multiple heads. The exact number varies depending on which ancient source you consult. Some say 7, some say 9, some say as many as 100. But the most commonly cited number is 9. And it had a property that made it functionally unkillable by conventional means. When you cut off one of its heads, 2 more grew in its place. You could hack at this creature all day, and by the end of it, the thing would have more heads than when you started. One of the heads was also immortal, incapable of being killed by any means at all. And its breath and its blood were so poisonous that merely being near it was dangerous. Hunters who had gone after it had died not from its bite, but from the toxic cloud that surrounded it. Hercules went with his nephew Iolaus. He drove the Hydra out of its lair in the swamp by shooting flaming arrows into the water. When it emerged, he began cutting off heads, and immediately discovered the problem. For every head he severed, 2 returned. Iolaus solved it. As Hercules cut each head off, Iolaus immediately cauterized the stump with a burning torch before new heads could grow. They worked together, one cutting and one burning, systematically working through the creature until only the immortal central head remained. That one Hercules buried under a boulder. Then he dipped his arrows in the creature's toxic blood, making them permanently poisonous, a detail that becomes important much later in the story. Now, the question. Was there a real Hydra in the swamp at Lerna? Here is where the historical interpretation becomes genuinely compelling, because there is a real animal that lives in freshwater environments that ancient Greeks would absolutely have encountered in a place like Lerna, and that behaves in a way that, if you did not understand the biology, would look almost exactly like what the myth describes. It is called a water snake, specifically the dice snake or the viperine snake, both of which are native to the wetlands of the Greek Peloponnese, and both of which are still found there today. These snakes are not individually dangerous to a healthy adult human, but they have a behavior that is remarkable. They live in large colonies. In a productive swamp like ancient Lerna, they would have been extraordinarily numerous, perhaps in the hundreds or thousands. And when you attack one, the disturbance draws others. You kill one snake, and suddenly there are 2 more in front of you. You kill those, and there are 4. The more you disturb the colony, the more animals emerge from the water and the vegetation. To an ancient hunter with no knowledge of colonial animal behavior, this would have looked precisely like what the myth describes. Cut off one head, 2 grow back. The poisonous breath and blood is also not as fantastical as it sounds. Rotting organic matter in a stagnant swamp produces methane and hydrogen sulfide, both of which are genuinely toxic in sufficient concentrations. Ancient hunters venturing into the deepest parts of a marsh might have experienced dizziness, nausea, and difficulty breathing, not from any monster, but from the gases rising from the mud. The swamp itself was the poison. The creature that lived at its heart was simply the visible symbol of an invisible danger. The cauterization detail is interesting too, because it is genuinely the correct strategy for dealing with a snake-infested swamp. Not literally burning the stumps of severed necks, but burning the vegetation. Fire was and remains one of the most effective tools for clearing wetland terrain and driving out or killing the animals that live in it. A team of men working systematically through a swamp with fire, driving the snakes out and killing them as they emerged, would look, to a watching outsider who did not understand what they were doing, something like the myth describes. And then there is the poisoned arrows detail. This is one of those moments in the Hercules story where the mythological and the historical seem to press very close together, because poison arrows were real. Toxicology in the ancient world was a genuine science, and hunters absolutely did use animal-derived toxins on their weapons. The word toxic itself comes from the Greek toxikon, which referred to the poison used on arrows. Dipping arrows in the venom of a water snake or in the toxic effluent of a swamp would produce a real and lethal weapon. The myth is describing a real practice and attributing it to a real event. Hercules discovered that the creatures of this swamp were venomous, And he used that venom for the rest of his life. There is also a political interpretation of this labour that historians find persuasive. The Lerna swamp was not just ecologically significant, it was agriculturally significant. Draining or controlling a swamp like Lerna would have opened up substantial fertile land for farming. The labour of clearing and managing the wetland, killing the snakes, burning the vegetation, perhaps digging drainage channels, would have been the kind of massive organised effort that required a leader of extraordinary capability and determination. Someone who organised and led that effort would have been remembered, would have been celebrated, would, over time, have been mythologized. The Hydra becomes the symbolic representation of everything the swamp was. Its multiple heads are the multiple problems, the snakes, the disease, the flooding, the impassable terrain. Its regrowth is the way these problems keep returning, no matter how many times you address them individually. And the final solution, the cauterization, is the systematic and permanent approach that finally solves them all at once. Hercules walked out of the swamp at Lerna with poisoned arrows and a labour completed. And the world he walked back into was, because of what he had done there, slightly more habitable than it had been before he went in. Which is, when you think about it, a more interesting story than a demigod killing a monster. It is a story about a man who looked at something everyone else had decided was simply too dangerous and too difficult, and found a way through it anyway. The third labour is different from the first two in a way that matters. There is no blood in it, no poison, no burning swamp or strangled predator. It is a chase, a long, patient, exhausting chase across mountains and forests, and eventually beyond the known borders of the Greek world. And the thing being chased is not a monster by any reasonable definition of the word. It is a deer. But not just any deer. The Ceryneian hind was a female deer, a hind of supernatural beauty and supernatural speed. Her hooves were said to be made of bronze, and her antlers of gold. She was sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, which meant that harming her in any way was not just difficult, but forbidden. Hercules could not kill her, could not wound her, could not even tire her out and tackle her the way he had tackled the Nemean lion. He had to catch her alive and unharmed and bring her back to Eurystheus without so much as scratching her. And she was faster than anything alive. The chase lasted a full year, 12 months of pursuit across the mountains of Arcadia, north into Thrace, and eventually all the way to the land of the Hyperboreans, a semi-mythical people who lived in Greek imagination somewhere at the far northern edge of the world, beyond the north wind. Some versions of the myth say Hercules finally caught the hind while she was sleeping or drinking from a river. Others say he shot her through the legs with an arrow, a shot precise enough to pin her without drawing blood. Either way, he caught her, slung her over his shoulders, and began the long walk back south. On the road he encountered Artemis herself, furious at the capture of her sacred animal. Hercules explained his situation, the compulsion of his labours, the need to complete this task. Artemis relented. He carried the hind back to Eurystheus, and then, as promised, released her. The question of what the Ceryneian hind actually was in the real world is one of the more interesting puzzles in the historical analysis of the Hercules myth. Because unlike the lion or the Hydra, the hind is not obviously dangerous. She is not a threat to be neutralized. She is a prize to be taken, which suggests a different kind of underlying story. The golden antlers are the first clue. Female deer do not have antlers. This is basic biology. In almost all deer species, only the males grow antlers, and they shed and regrow them annually. There is one exception in the modern world, and that is the reindeer, known in North America as the caribou, and it is the only deer species in which females regularly grow antlers. Reindeer are not native to Greece. They live in the far north, in Scandinavia and Siberia and the Arctic. But they were known to ancient Greeks through trade, and through the accounts of travellers who had ventured into northern Europe. A Greek, hearing a description of a female deer with antlers from a northern traveller, would have had no frame of reference for it. It would have sounded impossible, supernatural, the kind of thing that could only be explained by divine origin. The bronze hooves are similarly interesting. Reindeer hooves are large and broad compared to other deer, adapted for moving across snow and soft tundra. They make a distinctive sound when the animal runs, a clicking sound caused by a tendon in the foot that is unlike the sound of any deer native to the Mediterranean. Ancient Greeks encountering or hearing descriptions of this animal would have noticed both the unusual hooves and the unusual sound they made. Bronze, as a material, was associated with hardness and with the divine. Describing the hooves as bronze was a way of capturing something real, their unusual appearance and sound, in the metaphorical language available. And then there is the year-long chase. If the Ceryneian hind represents a real animal or a real quest, what was Hercules actually doing for 12 months? One interpretation that historians find plausible is that this labour represents a long-range diplomatic or exploratory mission rather than a hunt. In the Bronze Age world of the Augean, sending a capable warrior on a year-long journey to the northern edges of the known world and back would have been a significant undertaking. The sacred nature of the hind, her connection to Artemis, may reflect the political reality that whatever Hercules was pursuing in the north belonged to someone else, was under someone else's protection, and had to be obtained through patience and negotiation rather than force. You cannot just take the thing you want. You have to follow it, wait for the right moment, make your case to the people who consider it theirs, and then bring it home intact. There is also a simpler and more poetic reading. The third labour, coming after two violent and dangerous confrontations, is a test of a different quality entirely. Patience, self-control, the ability to pursue something over a long period of time without losing focus or giving up. The lion tested strength. The Hydra tested ingenuity. The Hind tests endurance. 12 months of running through mountains after an animal you cannot harm, knowing that the moment you grab for it too soon or too roughly, the whole enterprise fails. That is a different kind of difficulty. Not the difficulty of facing something terrifying, but the difficulty of sustaining effort and discipline across an entire year with no guarantee of success. The ancient Greeks understood this distinction. They had a word, karteria, that meant something like endurance or patient strength. The ability to hold on when holding on is the hardest thing. It was considered one of the great virtues, perhaps less glamorous than courage, but in many ways more rare. And the labour of the Ceryneian hind is, at its heart, a story about karteria, about what it takes to keep going when the thing you are chasing is always just ahead of you, always just out of reach. And the only option is to keep moving and trust that eventually the moment will come. Hercules came back from the north with the hind on his shoulders after a year away. Eurystheus saw her and was satisfied. And then Hercules let her go, back into the wild, back to Artemis. Because that had been the agreement, and because some things, even when you have caught them, are not yours to keep. The fourth labour sends Hercules into the mountains, specifically into the mountains of Arcadia, the wild, heavily forested highland region in the centre of the Peloponnese, that the ancient Greeks associated with wilderness and with Pan, the god of untamed nature. Arcadia was not a place of civilization. It was a place of hunters and shepherds and dense oak forest and rocky peaks that stayed cold well into spring. And somewhere in those mountains, on a peak called Erymanthus, there was a boar. The Erymanthian boar was not a metaphor for anything subtle. It was a boar. An enormous, violent, destructive wild boar that had been tearing through the farmland and villages around the mountain for years, killing livestock, destroying crops, and killing anyone who got close enough to try to stop it. Eurystheus wanted it captured alive, which was, if anything, more dangerous than killing it would have been. A wounded boar is one of the most dangerous animals a human being can face. An unwounded, uninjured, fully enraged boar, being driven and cornered and physically wrestled into submission, is something that most people throughout history have simply declined to attempt. Before Hercules even reached the mountain, he stopped to visit a centaur named Pholus, one of the few centaurs in Greek mythology portrayed as genuinely civilized and hospitable. Pholus welcomed Hercules, cooked him meat, and opened a jar of wine that had been given to him by Dionysus himself. The smell of the wine drew other centaurs, wilder and less friendly ones, and a brawl broke out. Hercules drove them off with his poisoned arrows, the same ones he had made from the Hydra's blood. Several centaurs died. Pholus himself died accidentally, picking up one of the fallen arrows and dropping it on his own foot. The wound from the Hydra-poisoned tip was fatal. It is one of the darker moments in the Hercules story, a good creature dying pointlessly because of a chaos Hercules had not intended to cause. Then Hercules went up the mountain. He drove the boar upward into the deep snow on the higher slopes, following it and harrying it, not letting it rest, not letting it stop and graze and recover its strength. This is a real hunting technique called persistence hunting, and it works on the same principle as the year-long chase of the Ceryneian Hind, except compressed into days rather than months. Large animals with heavy bodies overheat faster than lean humans do. A boar, driven continuously uphill through deep snow, will eventually exhaust itself, its legs breaking through the crust, its massive body burning enormous amounts of energy just to keep moving. When the boar finally collapsed from exhaustion in the deep snow, Hercules bound it with chains and carried it down the mountain on his shoulders. The image of him carrying it is one of the most reproduced in all of ancient Greek art. Pottery, sculptures, friezes, all across the Mediterranean world, you find Hercules with this enormous dark animal slung across his back, legs bound, head hanging. And Eurystheus, in the most famous version of the story, took one look at the living boar Hercules had brought back, and was so terrified that he hid in a large bronze storage jar and shouted instructions from inside it. It is one of the few genuinely comic moments in the entire cycle of labours, and the Greeks apparently found it funny too, because it appears again and again in the art. The great king, the man who had been tormenting Hercules with these impossible tasks, so frightened by the reality of what he had asked for, that he folded himself into a jar and refused to come out. Now, the historical reading of this labour is in some ways the most straightforward of all the ones we have examined. Wild boar were real, and they were genuinely dangerous. They are still found across Europe and Asia today, and they are still considered one of the more hazardous animals a hunter can pursue. A large male European wild boar can weigh over 200 kilograms. Its tusks, which curve upward and outward from the lower jaw, can reach 20 centimeters in length and are sharp enough to disembowel a human in a single upward slash. They are fast, they are aggressive when cornered, and unlike many large animals, they do not back down when confronted. They attack. They have been killing hunters and farmers and soldiers throughout recorded history. Julius Caesar mentioned them. Medieval hunting manuals devoted extensive sections to them. They were and are a real and serious threat. A particularly large or aggressive boar establishing a territory around a mountain like Erymanthus and raiding the farmland below would have been a genuine regional crisis. Crops destroyed, livestock killed, farmers afraid to work their fields. The economic damage alone would have been severe, leaving aside the human casualties. Dealing with such an animal would have required someone of extraordinary physical capability and extraordinary nerve. The specific technique described in the myth, driving the animal uphill into deep snow to exhaust it, is not only plausible, but is essentially what a skilled hunter would actually do. You do not want to corner a healthy boar. You want to control the terrain and let the animal defeat itself. The centaur episode is harder to naturalize, but not impossible. Centaurs in Greek mythology are often interpreted by historians as representing the wild, horse-riding peoples of the northern steppes. Cultures that, to settled Greek farmers, seemed half human and half animal in their nomadic, mounted way of life. An encounter between Hercules and a band of such people, turning violent over wine and territory, fits comfortably into the Bronze Age world. The accidental death of Pholus is the kind of specific, unhappy detail that tends to survive in stories because it is too pointless and too sad to be invented for dramatic effect. Real accidents have that quality. They do not serve the narrative. They just happen. And then you have to live with them.
The Boar itself was eventually released, like the Hind before it, or, in some versions, taken to a specific location and let go there. Which raises a question that nobody in the ancient sources seems to bother asking, but that strikes me as genuinely interesting. What happened to it afterward? A boar that had been driven to exhaustion in deep mountain snow and then carried down a mountain in chains and presented to a terrified king in a bronze jar. Did it recover? Did it go back to the mountain? Did it continue to terrorize the farmland below Erymanthus for years afterward? And did people look at it differently now, knowing that a man had caught it with his bare hands and chosen to let it go? I think they probably did. I think a boar that Hercules had touched and released would have occupied a strange category in the minds of the people who lived near that mountain. Not quite a monster anymore. Not quite an ordinary animal either. Something in between. Something marked.
The fifth labor is the one that does not fit. Every other labor involves something dangerous, a predator to be killed or captured, a monster to be neutralized, a threat to be eliminated. But the fifth labor is cleaning. Specifically, cleaning a stable. And on the surface, that sounds like an insult, like Eurystheus running out of genuinely dangerous tasks and resorting to humiliation instead. But when you look at the actual details of what Hercules was asked to do, the scale of it, the logistics of it, the sheer physical impossibility of it by conventional means, it stops looking like an insult and starts looking like something else entirely. King Augean ruled Elis, a region in the western Peloponnese. He was famous throughout Greece for one thing above all others: his cattle. He had more cattle than anyone in the known world. Some versions of the myth say 3,000, others say as many as 12,000. He had inherited a divine gift. His cattle never got sick. They were always healthy and fertile, and they bred prolifically. Which meant that over the decades the herds had grown to a size that no normal farming operation could manage. And the stables and yards where they were kept had not been cleaned in 30 years. 30 years of waste from thousands of cattle. The scale of that is difficult to fully imagine, but it is worth trying. A single cow produces roughly 65 pounds of manure per day. Multiply that by even the most conservative estimate of Augeas's herd size, and you are looking at something in the range of 200,000 pounds of waste accumulating every single day for 30 years. The stables would not have smelled bad. They would have been a public health catastrophe. The surrounding land would have been contaminated and unusable. The rivers and streams flowing through the region would have been fouled. Disease would have been endemic. The entire agricultural productivity of Elis would have been compromised by this accumulated biological disaster. Eurystheus gave Hercules 1 day to clean it. 1 day. Which was not a labor so much as a joke. No number of workers with shovels could have made a meaningful dent in 30 years of accumulated waste in a single day. Which is presumably exactly what Eurystheus intended. The labor was designed to be failed, to be humiliating, to demonstrate the limits of even Hercules' legendary capability. You can strangle a lion, you can drain a swamp, but you cannot move a mountain of filth with your bare hands in 24 hours. Hercules looked at the problem and did something that the myth presents as a stroke of genius, but that is, on reflection, exactly what a practically minded engineer would do. He did not pick up a shovel. He looked at the landscape. 2 rivers ran near the stables of Augean, the Alpheus and the Peneus, both real rivers that still exist today in the western Peloponnese. Hercules diverted them. He broke down the stable walls on 2 sides and cut channels in the earth to redirect the flow of both rivers directly through the stables and yards. The water did, in hours, what no army of workers could have done in months. It scoured everything clean. When it was done, he redirected the rivers back to their original courses, and the stables were clean. Before he did any of this, he had gone to Augean and made a deal. He would clean the stables in a single day in exchange for 1/10 of the cattle. Augean agreed, apparently considering the whole thing an impossibility. When Hercules actually succeeded, Augean refused to pay. He claimed that it was the rivers that had done the work, not Hercules, and therefore no payment was owed. This dispute became the origin, in later myth, of the Olympic Games, because Hercules is said to have founded the games at Olympia in Elis as part of the resolution of his conflict with Augean. And when Eurystheus heard about the deal Hercules had made with Augean, the attempt to earn payment for a labor, he declared the labor invalid and did not count it, which meant Hercules had to complete an extra labor later to make up for it. The historical reading of the Augean stables is perhaps the most transparently practical of all the labors. There is nothing supernatural here at all. No monster, no divine creature, no magical property. Just an engineering problem of enormous scale, solved with intelligence rather than strength. And that, historians suggest, may be exactly the point. Because the tradition that gave us the Hercules myth was not interested only in celebrating brute force. The Greeks admired cleverness. They admired the person who looked at an impossible problem and found the angle that everyone else had missed. Odysseus was their great hero of cunning, but Hercules, despite his reputation as a strongman, was also meant to embody practical intelligence, the ability to see past the obvious approach to the one that actually works. The hydraulic engineering described in this labor is also not as anachronistic as it might seem. The ancient world had a sophisticated understanding of water management. The Minoan civilization on Crete, which predated classical Greece, and which would have been a living memory in the Bronze Age, built elaborate drainage and plumbing systems. The civilizations of Mesopotamia had been managing rivers and building irrigation canals for thousands of years. Diverting a river was not a magical act in the Bronze Age. It was a known technique, used for agriculture and for flood control. A man who knew how to do it, and had the physical capability and organizational ability to actually execute it, would have been remarkable and worth remembering. But not in the realm of the supernatural. What strikes me most about this labor is the detail about the payment and the dispute. It is such a mundane, recognizably human complication. Hercules does the impossible thing, fulfills his end of the bargain, and then the king wriggles out of paying because he can find a technicality. Augean is not a monster. He is just a dishonest man trying to keep his cattle. And Eurystheus' decision to disqualify the labor because Hercules tried to get paid for it is the move of a bureaucrat. Someone who understands that the rules can be used as weapons just as effectively as swords. These are not mythological dynamics. These are political ones. They are the dynamics of real disputes between real people in the real world. And their presence in the story, their specificity and their pettiness, suggests that somewhere underneath the myth there is a memory of an actual disagreement between actual people that actually mattered to someone enough to preserve it across 3,000 years of retelling. The sixth labor takes Hercules to a lake. A specific, real, still existing lake in the northeastern Peloponnese called Lake Stymphalis, nestled in a high mountain valley in Arcadia. The valley is bowl-shaped, surrounded on all sides by steep forested slopes, and in ancient times the lake was significantly larger than it is today, fed by underground springs and with no natural outlet, so that the water level rose and fell unpredictably, and the surrounding marshland expanded and contracted with the seasons. It was remote and difficult to reach, and the people who lived nearby had a problem that had been getting steadily worse for years. The problem was birds. The Stymphalian birds were a flock of creatures that had colonized the lake and the surrounding marsh and forest. The myth describes them in ways that vary somewhat depending on the source, but certain details are consistent across all versions. They were large. They had beaks and claws and feathers of bronze or iron, sharp enough to be used as weapons. They could launch their feathers like arrows, shooting them at targets below with enough force to penetrate armor. They ate human flesh. They had been multiplying unchecked for years and had reached a population large enough to devastate the surrounding farmland, eating crops, killing livestock, attacking and killing people who ventured too close to the lake. The entire region around Stymphalis had effectively been abandoned. Hercules arrived at the lake and immediately encountered the first real obstacle. The birds were roosting in the dense marsh vegetation and in the trees around the lake's edge. He could not get close enough to shoot them without wading into the marsh, and the marsh was too soft and too deep to support his weight. He was stuck on the shore with an enormous flock of dangerous birds just out of reach, and no obvious way to get to them. The goddess Athena intervened, giving him a rattle, a large bronze noise-making instrument made by the divine craftsman Hephaestus. Hercules climbed to high ground above the lake and shook the rattle. The noise was enormous, shattering the silence of the mountain valley, and the birds erupted from the marsh in a massive, panicked flock. As they rose into the air, Hercules shot them with his arrows, killing as many as he could. The survivors fled and never returned. Now, what were the Stymphalian birds? This is one of the most debated questions in the naturalistic interpretation of the Hercules myth, because there are several genuinely plausible answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first and most straightforward is that the birds were simply birds, a large colonial waterbird species, perhaps a heron or a cormorant or a species of ibis, present in enormous numbers, aggressively territorial during breeding season, and capable of genuine harm to humans who disturbed their nesting sites. Colonial waterbirds can be surprisingly dangerous when threatened. They mob intruders. They use their beaks and wings as weapons. A large enough flock of aggressively defensive birds could absolutely drive people away from a lakeshore and make farming in the surrounding area extremely difficult. The metal feathers are the mythological amplification of the real experience of being struck repeatedly by hard, sharp beaks and wing edges. The human flesh-eating is the mythological amplification of the real observation that large waterbirds eat fish and other animals, and can, in extreme circumstances, be dangerous to small children or weakened individuals. The rattle technique is also real. Noise has been used to drive birds away from agricultural land for as long as there has been agricultural land. Scarecrows, noisemakers, recorded distress calls, all of these are modern versions of the same basic principle that Hercules used at Lake Stymphalis. Flushing birds from dense cover with noise so that they can be shot or driven away is a genuine hunting technique. The detail of climbing to high ground first is tactically correct. You want to be above the birds as they rise, so that you are shooting downward rather than upward, which is both more accurate and more effective. But there is a second interpretation that some historians find more compelling, and that involves not birds at all, but people. The Greek word for the Stymphalian creatures is not entirely clear in its original meaning, and some scholars have suggested that what the myth is actually remembering is a tribe or a band of raiders who had made the Lake Stymphalis region their base of operations. Raiders who wore feathered or winged armor, which was not uncommon in the Bronze Age world. Raiders who used arrows, the mythological feathers that fly through the air and pierce armor. Raiders who had been preying on the surrounding settlements for years, eating their food, killing their people, until the entire region was depopulated and the land was abandoned. Under this interpretation, the labour becomes a military campaign rather than a hunt. Hercules arrived with his weapons and his reputation, used noise or some equivalent psychological shock tactic to draw the raiders out of their defensible position in the marsh and forest, and then engaged them in open ground where his superior capability was decisive. The ones he did not kill fled and did not come back. Both interpretations are plausible, and both are consistent with the specific details the myth preserves. What is interesting is that they are not necessarily in conflict. A marshy lake valley that had become genuinely difficult to approach because of a combination of a large, aggressive bird population and a band of human raiders using the isolation to their advantage, would have been, to the surrounding population, essentially indistinguishable from a place haunted by supernatural creatures. The marsh itself, like the swamp at Lerna, would have been associated with disease and death. The birds would have been genuinely dangerous and numerous. The raiders would have been genuinely lethal. The combination of all of these things, compressing over generations of retelling into a single monstrous entity with bronze feathers and a taste for human flesh, is exactly the kind of process by which real threats become mythological monsters. There is also something worth noticing about the sequence of the labours so far. The first was pure physical confrontation. The second required ingenuity and a partner. The third required patience across an entire year. The fourth required knowledge of terrain and animal behaviour. The fifth required engineering. And the sixth required the ability to recognize a tactical problem and solve it with the right tool rather than with brute force. The labours are not just a list of heroic deeds. They are a curriculum. Each one tests a different quality. Each one requires something that the previous ones did not. And the accumulation of them, taken together, is a portrait of a complete human capability. Not just strength, not just courage, but wisdom, patience, ingenuity, restraint, and the ability to ask for help when you need it. Which is what Hercules did when Athena handed him the rattle. He did not refuse it on the grounds that a hero should solve his problems alone. He took it, climbed the hill, and shook it as hard as he could. The seventh labour crosses the sea. For the first time in the cycle, Hercules leaves the Greek mainland entirely and travels to an island. The island is Crete, the largest island in the Mediterranean, sitting in the sea south of the Greek mainland, and it is a place that would have carried enormous weight in the imagination of any Bronze Age Greek. Because Crete was not just an island, it was the centre of the Minoan civilization, the oldest and in many ways the most sophisticated culture in the Augean world, a maritime empire that had dominated the region for centuries before the Mycenaean Greeks rose to prominence. By the time of Hercules, in the late Bronze Age, the Minoans were in decline, their great palace at Knossos damaged and diminished, their sea power fading. But their memory and their mythology was still vivid and still powerful, and their mythology was full of bulls. The bull was the central sacred animal of Minoan Crete. It appears everywhere in Minoan art, on frescoes and seal rings and pottery and sculpture. There are images of young men and women performing acrobatic leaps over charging bulls, vaulting over their horns in a ritual sport that required extraordinary athleticism and nerve. The bull represented power and divinity, and the wild force of nature that human civilization had to contend with, and ultimately could not fully tame. The most famous story connecting Crete and bulls is of course the story of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature born of an unnatural union and kept in the labyrinth beneath the palace of King Minos. But the Cretan bull, the subject of Hercules' seventh labour, predates the Minotaur in the mythological timeline, and is in some versions the animal whose offspring eventually became the Minotaur itself. The Cretan bull had been sent to King Minos by Poseidon, the god of the sea. The deal was simple. Poseidon would send a magnificent bull from the sea as a sign of divine favour, and Minos would sacrifice it back to the god. But when the bull arrived, it was so beautiful, so perfect, that Minos could not bring himself to kill it. He substituted an inferior animal for the sacrifice, and kept the divine bull for his own herds. Poseidon, enraged at this substitution, punished Minos in the worst way he could imagine. He caused Minos's wife, Pasiphae, to fall into an obsessive and unnatural love for the bull. The offspring of that union was the Minotaur. And the bull itself, maddened by divine influence, had broken free of any control and was now running wild across Crete, destroying everything in its path. Eurystheus sent Hercules to capture it alive and bring it back to the mainland. Minos, in the versions of the story that bother to include him, gave his permission. He was presumably relieved to have someone else deal with the problem. Hercules found the bull, wrestled it into submission with his bare hands in a scene that echoes the Nemean lion, though the bull is a fundamentally different kind of animal and requires a fundamentally different approach. He tamed it enough to ride it across the sea, sitting on its back as it swam from Crete to the Peloponnese, which is a detail that suggests something more like a skilled animal handler breaking and riding a difficult animal than a supernatural feat of strength. He brought it to Eurystheus, who dedicated it to Hera, and then released it. The bull wandered north into Attica, the region around Athens, where it eventually became known as the Marathonian bull, and continued to cause trouble, until it was killed by Theseus, the hero of Athens, in one of his own early labours. The historical reading of this labour is fascinating, precisely because of the Minoan context. Bull leaping, the practice depicted so extensively in Minoan art, was real. It was not symbolic decoration. It was an actual physical practice, likely ritual in nature, in which trained athletes literally vaulted over the backs and horns of large bulls. To do this successfully, you had to approach a charging bull, seize its horns, allow the animal's upward toss of its head to launch you into the air, somersault over its back, and land behind it. The physical demands of this practice were extraordinary. The danger was obvious, and the training required to do it safely, to the extent that it could be done safely at all, would have produced people with an almost incomprehensible degree of skill and fearlessness in dealing with large, powerful, dangerous cattle. A Mycenaean Greek warrior arriving on Crete and encountering this tradition would have seen things that seemed impossible. Men and women handling bulls with a casual mastery that made the animal seem almost domesticated, almost controllable in the hands of the right person. The idea of Hercules capturing the Cretan bull by essentially dominating it physically, wrestling it into submission, and then riding it across the sea is not so far from the real skills that Minoan bull handlers actually possessed. The myth may be remembering a real encounter with a real Minoan or post-Minoan bull handling tradition, the memory of which, filtered through Greek eyes and Greek values, became the story of a hero capturing a divine animal. The bull's later career is also interesting from a historical perspective. The animal that Hercules brought from Crete and that Eurystheus then released ends up wandering all the way to Marathon, north of Athens. Marathon is a real place. It is famous primarily as the site of the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, where the Athenians defeated the Persian army. But in the mythological tradition, it is also the place where Theseus killed the Marathonian bull, completing one of his own pre-labyrinth adventures. The persistence of this particular animal across multiple heroic traditions, Cretan myth, the Hercules cycle and the Theseus cycle, suggests that it may represent something more than a single narrative convenience. It may be a memory of a real population of large, dangerous, semi-feral cattle in the region of Attica that caused genuine problems for a long period, and that required genuine heroism to deal with. Cattle in the ancient Augean were not the placid, domesticated animals we are accustomed to thinking of today. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, was a massive and ferocious animal. Adult males stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and could weigh over 1,000 kilograms. They were hunted as big game across Europe and Asia for thousands of years. The process of domestication was long and incomplete, and early domestic cattle retained much of the size and aggression of their wild ancestors. A large bull that had been living semi-wild on a large island like Crete for years, perhaps never fully broken or controlled, would have been a genuinely formidable and dangerous animal. Not a monster, not divine, but real enough and dangerous enough that capturing it alive would have required exactly the kind of extraordinary capability that the myth attributes to Hercules. He swam it home across the sea, and on the shore of the Peloponnese, dripping and exhausted and smelling strongly of bull, he handed it over to Eurystheus and waited to be told what came next. The 8th labor takes Hercules north, further north than any of the previous labors have sent him, out of the familiar Greek world and into the edges of a region that the ancient Greeks regarded with a mixture of fascination and genuine unease. Thrace. The land that occupies roughly the northeastern corner of modern Greece and extends into what is now Bulgaria and European Turkey. In the Bronze Age and well into the Classical period, Thrace was considered a wild and barbarous place, populated by fierce tribes who lived by war and who had customs that civilized Greeks found disturbing. They tattooed their bodies. They sacrificed animals in ways the Greeks considered excessive. They were renowned as horsemen, some of the finest in the ancient world, and their horses were famous throughout the Mediterranean for their size and their quality and their ferocity. King Diomedes of Thrace had horses, 4 of them specifically, that had become notorious across the known world. They were enormous animals, stronger and faster than any horses in Greece, and Diomedes kept them in chains because there was no other way to contain them. They were man-eaters, not metaphorically, literally. Diomedes fed them human flesh. Specifically, he fed them the flesh of his guests, the strangers who arrived at his court seeking hospitality, which in the ancient Greek world was one of the most sacred social obligations that existed. The violation of guest friendship, xenia, was considered one of the worst things a person could do. It was the crime that started the Trojan War, and Diomedes was committing it systematically, welcoming strangers and then feeding them to his horses, a practice so monstrous that it had attracted the attention of the gods, and apparently of Eurystheus as well. Hercules was sent to bring the horses back. He arrived in Thrace with a small group of companions, young men who had volunteered to join him. He overpowered the grooms who were guarding the horses and drove the animals to the coast, where he left them in the care of his companions while he went back to deal with Diomedes. Diomedes pursued him with an armed force. In the fight that followed, Hercules killed Diomedes, and then, in an act that is either poetic justice or dark pragmatism, depending on how you read it, fed the king's body to his own horses. The horses, having eaten their master, became calm, docile even. Hercules bridled them and led them back to Greece without difficulty. One of the young men who had come with Hercules was named Abderus, a youth he was particularly fond of. While Hercules was fighting Diomedes, Abderus was left in charge of the horses. The horses killed him and ate him. Hercules, returning victorious from his fight, found what remained of his friend and was devastated. He founded a city near the spot and named it Abdera, in honor of the dead youth. Abdera was a real city. It existed historically on the Thracian coast. It was the birthplace of the philosopher Democritus, who first proposed the atomic theory of matter. The city's mythological founding by Hercules, in memory of a friend eaten by horses, is the kind of specific, grief-laden detail that does not feel invented. It feels remembered. The man-eating horses are the central mystery of this labor, and they have attracted a wide range of naturalistic interpretations. The most straightforward is that they were simply horses that had been trained or conditioned through abuse and deprivation to be extremely aggressive and dangerous. Horses are not natural carnivores, but they can and do eat meat when sufficiently hungry and when meat is made available to them. There are documented historical cases of horses in situations of severe food deprivation consuming flesh. A horse that has been kept in chains, deliberately starved, and regularly presented with human remains as food could absolutely develop the behavior the myth describes. The conditioning would have made them genuinely dangerous and genuinely difficult to handle, which explains both why Diomedes kept them chained and why the rest of the world found them terrifying. There is also a political interpretation that historians find compelling. Diomedes was a real king, or at least represents a real type of ruler, the powerful warlord of a border region who grew wealthy by preying on travelers and traders passing through his territory. The Thracian coast was an important route for maritime trade in the Bronze Age. Ships traveling between the Augean and the Black Sea had to pass through the straits nearby. A king who controlled that coastline and who had a reputation for seizing and killing travelers would have been a genuine threat to trade and to the political stability of the region. His horses, the symbols of his military power and his wealth, might have been famous for their quality and their ferocity without being literally carnivorous. The man-eating might be a mythological compression of the real fact that Diomedes used his horses in raids and battles that killed people, that his cavalry was his instrument of predation and murder. Under this reading, Hercules' labor is a military and political mission. He goes to Thrace, defeats a dangerous warlord, liberates the region from his predatory control, and brings back the symbols of that warlord's power as trophies. The taming of the horses after Diomedes' death reflects the real dynamic by which a military force that was terrifying under one commander can become manageable under another. The horses were not supernatural. They were weapons, and like all weapons, they depended on the person wielding them. The detail of feeding Diomedes to his own horses is worth dwelling on. It appears in multiple ancient sources, and it has the quality of a story that has been deliberately preserved because it felt just, because it completed something. The man who had fed his guests to his horses was himself fed to his horses. The symmetry of it was satisfying to the ancient Greeks in a way that went beyond simple revenge. It was a moral statement. What you do to others can be done to you. The instrument of your cruelty can become the instrument of your punishment. And the person who arranges that outcome is not just a hero. He is an agent of a kind of cosmic balance, someone who looks at a wrong and finds the most fitting possible way to right it. Hercules brought the horses back to Eurystheus, who dedicated them to Hera. They were eventually released and wandered into the wild on Mount Olympus, where, according to later myth, they were killed by other wild animals. Which is perhaps the most realistic ending any of the creatures in these labors receives. They were dangerous animals in an environment full of other dangerous animals, and eventually the world caught up with them. No divine intervention, no second life as constellation or myth. Just horses in the mountains, meeting the fate that all wild things eventually meet. Abdera stood on the coast of Thrace for centuries after. People lived and worked and philosophized there. Democritus looked at the world around him and proposed that everything was made of invisible, indivisible particles moving through empty space, an idea so far ahead of its time that it would not be confirmed for 2,000 years. And the city that produced him was named for a young man eaten by horses on a beach in Thrace, while his friend was away fighting a warlord. History accumulates in strange ways.
The threads connect across centuries in patterns that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. And sometimes the smallest, saddest details are the ones that last the longest. The ninth labour is different from everything that has come before it in one fundamental way. Every previous labour has sent Hercules against an animal, or a natural force, or a monstrous aberration of some kind. A lion, a serpent, a boar, birds, bulls, horses. The enemy has always been something that does not think, does not plan, does not negotiate. But the ninth labour sends Hercules against people. Specifically, against a nation of warrior women. And the thing he has been sent to retrieve is not a creature to be captured or a threat to be eliminated, but an object, a belt, a girdle, a decorated band of leather or metal worn around the waist of a queen. The queen was Hippolyta, ruler of the Amazons, and the Amazons require some attention before we get to the labour itself, because they are one of the most persistently fascinating and persistently misunderstood elements of the entire Greek mythological tradition. The standard image of the Amazons in popular culture is of a race of superhuman warrior women living in an all-female society, cutting off one breast to better draw a bow, at perpetual war with the male world. Most of that image is late embellishment, added and exaggerated over centuries of retelling. What the earliest Greek sources actually say is considerably more interesting and considerably more historically plausible. The Amazons in the oldest traditions were a real or semi-real people living somewhere to the northeast of the Greek world, in the region around the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains and the Eurasian steppe beyond. They were famous for two things. They were warriors and they rode horses. Both of these things, in the context of the ancient world, were transgressive enough for Greek men to have found them deeply unsettling without needing to add any supernatural elements. Greek women of the classical period did not fight. They did not ride horses into battle. The idea of an entire society in which women did both of these things as a matter of course was genuinely strange and genuinely threatening to the Greek male imagination. Strange and threatening enough to generate centuries of mythology about them. But here is what archaeology has found in the last several decades on the Eurasian steppe, in the burial mounds of the Scythian and Sarmatian peoples who lived exactly where the Greeks placed the Amazons. Women buried with weapons. Women buried with horses. Women whose bones show the same patterns of injury and stress that you find in the bones of warriors and riders. Women who fought and rode and apparently led. Not all women in these cultures, and not a separate all-female society, but women who participated in the military life of their communities in ways that Greek women simply did not. The Amazons were not a fantasy. They were a memory, distorted and mythologized, of real cultures the Greeks had encountered or heard about on the edges of their world. Hippolyta's girdle was not a trivial object. In the myth, it had been given to her by Ares, the god of war, as a mark of her authority and her excellence as a warrior. It was her badge of leadership, the visible symbol of her status.
Eurystheus wanted it because his daughter Admete wanted it, which is the most mundane motivation in the entire cycle of labors. Not divine punishment, not regional crisis. A king's daughter wanted a pretty thing that belonged to someone else, and her father sent Hercules to get it. Hercules sailed to the land of the Amazons with a company of companions. When he arrived, Hippolyta came to meet him, and the initial encounter was, in most versions of the story, surprisingly peaceful. Hippolyta was impressed by Hercules, by his reputation and his presence, and she agreed to give him the girdle voluntarily. No fight necessary, no conquest, just a straightforward exchange between two people who respected each other's capability, which would have made this the easiest labor of all 12 if Hera had not intervened. Hera, who had been orchestrating Hercules' suffering since before his birth, disguised herself as an Amazon warrior and moved through Hippolyta's camp spreading a rumor. Hercules had come to kidnap the queen, she whispered. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to take Hippolyta by force. The Amazons armed themselves and rode against Hercules and his companions. In the battle that followed, Hercules, believing that Hippolyta had set him up, killed her and took the girdle from her body. Then he and his companions fought their way back to their ships and sailed home. The historical reading of this labor operates on several levels simultaneously. The most literal is simply that Hercules, or whoever the real person behind Hercules might have been, led a military expedition into the Black Sea region and came back with something valuable. Expeditions from the Mycenaean Greek world into the Black Sea were real. The myth of Jason and the Argonauts, which overlaps with the Hercules tradition in several places, is widely interpreted as a mythologized memory of real Bronze Age voyages into the Black Sea in search of trade goods and resources: gold, timber, grain, horses. The Pontic steppe was rich in all of these things, and Greek sailors knew it. The girdle as the object of the quest is interesting from an anthropological perspective. Decorated belts and girdles were significant objects in many Bronze Age cultures. They appear in grave goods across a wide geographic range. They were markers of status and identity in ways that are hard to fully reconstruct, but that clearly mattered enormously to the people who wore them. Bringing back the girdle of a warrior queen from the edge of the known world would have been, in the Bronze Age context, a genuine political and cultural trophy. Not just a pretty piece of clothing, but a statement about power and reach and capability. The role of Hera in destroying what might have been a peaceful resolution is one of the most humanly recognizable moments in the entire labor cycle. The misunderstanding that turns a negotiation into a battle. The rumor that undoes a diplomatic success. The moment where everything could have gone right and instead goes catastrophically wrong because someone decided to interfere. Hera, in the Greek tradition, functions as a kind of divine representation of all the forces that conspire against human success. Jealousy, misinformation, the randomness of bad timing. But in a historical reading, she represents something more mundane and more familiar. The way that fear and suspicion can destroy trust between people who might otherwise have reached an understanding. Hippolyta was willing to give Hercules what he came for. Her warriors were not. And the gap between those two positions exploited by someone who wanted conflict rather than peace, produced a battle that nobody needed to fight, and a death that did not need to happen. Hercules sailed home with a belt stained with the blood of the woman who had been willing to give it to him freely. It is one of the darker endings in the labor cycle, not triumphant, not clean, just a thing that happened in a distant place, with consequences that could not be undone. He gave the girdle to Eurystheus, who gave it to his daughter Admete, who presumably wore it and was pleased with it, and never thought about Hippolyta at all, which is perhaps the most human detail of the entire story. The enormous cost of a small vanity. The life of a queen exchanged for a decoration. History is full of that kind of transaction, and it never gets any easier to look at directly. The 10th labor is the longest journey Hercules has yet been asked to make. Every previous labor has kept him within the known world. The Greek mainland, Crete, Thrace, the Black Sea coast, places that were real and mapped and understood, at least roughly. But the 10th labor sends him to the edge of the world, to a place that the ancient Greeks called the Far West, beyond the point where the Mediterranean narrows and the known sea ends, and something else begins. He is going to an island called Erythea, the Red Island, named for the color of the sunset sky that hangs over it in the west. And he is going there to steal cattle. The cattle belonged to a giant named Geryon, and Geryon is one of the most visually distinctive creatures in the entire mythological tradition, because the ancient sources are consistent about one very specific and very strange detail of his appearance. He had 3 bodies, not 3 heads, though some versions add that as well. 3 complete torsos joined at the waist, 6 arms, and presumably 3 sets of everything above the hip, though the ancient artists who tried to render him in sculpture and on pottery struggled with the logistics of this and came up with varying solutions. He was guarded by a 2-headed dog named Orthrus, the brother of Cerberus, and by a herdsman named Eurytion, who was himself a formidable fighter. Hercules' journey to Erythea is, in many ways, more interesting than the labor itself. To reach the far west, he had to cross the desert of Libya, and at some point during this crossing, he became so frustrated by the heat of the sun that he aimed his bow at Helios, the sun god, and threatened to shoot him. Helios, apparently more amused than offended, gave Hercules the golden cup he used to sail across the ocean from west to east each night after completing his daily journey across the sky. Hercules used this cup as a boat to cross the ocean to Erythea. He also, at the point where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, erected 2 massive pillars to mark the boundary of the known world. These are the Pillars of Hercules. The Strait of Gibraltar, still there, still bearing his name in the mythological tradition, even if not on modern maps. On Erythea, Hercules killed Orthrus with his club, then killed Eurytion the herdsman, then killed Geryon himself with an arrow that passed through all 3 of his bodies simultaneously. He gathered the cattle and began the long drive back to Greece, overland, because the myth insists on the return journey being made on foot, which transforms the labour from a single violent encounter into an epic trek across the entire breadth of the known world. The journey home took months. Geryon's cattle were driven through Spain and southern France, and over the Alps, and down through Italy, and across the toe of the boot, and through Sicily, and along the length of the Greek world, before finally arriving at Mycenae. Along the way, various adventures happened. Cattle were stolen and recovered. Local kings were fought and killed. And Hercules left traces of himself across the entire Western Mediterranean in the form of place names and local cults and founding myths. The geographical scope of this labour is extraordinary, and it is, historically speaking, one of the most important elements of the entire Hercules tradition. Because the route that Hercules travels on his return journey with the cattle of Geryon maps almost exactly onto the real trade routes of the Bronze Age and early Iron Age Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, the great maritime traders of the ancient world, had established colonies along exactly this route. Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, the toe of Italy, the Greek mainland. These were not mythological places. They were real nodes in a real trading network that connected the Western Mediterranean to the Augean. And the founding myths that attached themselves to Hercules' route, the cities he supposedly founded or passed through, correspond remarkably well to real Phoenician and early Greek colonial settlements. Some historians have proposed that the Geryon myth is a mythologized memory of early Greek contact with the far western Mediterranean, possibly mediated through Phoenician traders who knew the route. The island of Erythea has been tentatively identified with the area around modern Cadiz in southern Spain, which was indeed a major Phoenician trading post known in antiquity as Gadir. The cattle of Geryon may represent the famous cattle herds of the Iberian Peninsula, which were genuinely renowned in the ancient world for their quality and their numbers. And Geryon himself, the three-bodied giant who ruled the far west, may be a mythological representation of a powerful local ruler or a confederation of related tribes. The three bodies being a way of expressing something like a triple alliance or a three-part political structure. The pillars of Hercules are worth dwelling on. The Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the southern tip of Spain and the northern tip of Morocco, was the boundary of the known Mediterranean world for ancient sailors. Beyond it was the open Atlantic, which Greek sailors of the Bronze Age knew almost nothing about, and which they regarded with genuine fear. The ocean beyond the pillars was not just unknown, it was conceptually different from the inland sea they knew. It was the edge of the world. It was where the sun went when it set. It was where the dead went when they died. Because in many ancient traditions, the land of the dead lay in the far west, beyond the sunset. Hercules planting his pillars at that boundary was doing something cosmologically significant. he was marking the limit. He was saying, "This far and no further," which is interesting because it is both a declaration of accomplishment and an acknowledgement of limit. Even Hercules did not go beyond the pillars. Even he recognized that there were boundaries the human world did not cross. Or at least, that is how the Greeks read it. The Phoenicians, of course, crossed those boundaries all the time. They sailed up the Atlantic coast of Europe as far as Britain. They may have reached the coast of West Africa. The pillars that Hercules planted as a marker of the world's edge were, to the Phoenicians, simply a navigational landmark on a route they used regularly, which perhaps says something about the relativity of the impossible. What one culture calls the edge of the world, another culture calls Tuesday. Geryon's 3 bodies have attracted a range of interpretations beyond the political one. Some scholars see in the triple-bodied giant a remnant of very old Indo-European mythology about a 3-headed or 3-bodied opponent of a divine hero, a pattern that appears in several different ancient traditions. Others see it as a way of expressing extraordinary size and power, the idea that one body's worth of strength was insufficient to capture what this being was, that it took 3 times the normal human endowment to make a ruler powerful enough to hold these cattle at the edge of the world. And some, more practically minded, see it as a confusion arising from the translation of a foreign word or concept that Greek storytellers did not fully understand and represented as literally as they could. Whatever Geryon was, he lost. His cattle made the long walk home across the breadth of the known world, leaving hoofprints across Spain and France and Italy and Greece that the local traditions remembered and incorporated into their own stories for centuries afterward. The labor of the cattle of Geryon is not really about a monster on an island. It is about the world itself, its size and its strangeness, and the human capacity to cross it against all reason and all probability and come back with something to show for the journey. The 11th labor sends Hercules somewhere that no previous labor has required him to go. Not to a dangerous region on the edge of the known world, not across a sea to a foreign island, not into a swamp or a mountain or a lake valley. It sends him to the edge of existence itself, to the garden at the end of the world, where the daughters of the evening tend a tree that grows golden apples, and where a serpent that never sleeps coils around the trunk and watches everything with eyes that have not closed since the world began. The Garden of the Hesperides. The Hesperides themselves were the daughters of the evening, nymphs whose name derives from the Greek word for west, Hesperia, the same root that gives us the word Vesper, the evening star. They lived at the far western edge of the world, beyond even the pillars of Hercules that Hercules himself had planted on his previous labor, in a garden of extraordinary beauty, where the light was always the golden light of late afternoon, and the air was always warm, and the tree at the center of the garden bore apples of pure gold. The tree had been a wedding gift from Gaia, the earth herself, to Hera when she married Zeus. Hera had planted it in the garden and set the Hesperides to tend it, and wrapped around its trunk a serpent named Ladon, who never slept, whose 100 heads watched every direction at once, and whose duty was to make sure that no one ever took the apples. Eurystheus wanted 3 of them. The first problem Hercules faced was that he did not know where the garden was. Nobody did. It existed in a place that was not quite on any map, at the intersection of geography and myth, where the real world shaded into something else. He traveled, he asked, he encountered various beings along the way who gave him pieces of the answer. He wrestled with the sea god Nereus, the old man of the sea, who could change his shape into any form, but who Hercules held on to through every transformation, until Nereus gave up and told him the direction he needed to go. He passed through the Caucasus Mountains, where he found Prometheus, the Titan who had stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity, still chained to his rock, still having his liver eaten each day by an eagle, still regenerating each night for the torment to begin again. Hercules shot the eagle with one of his poisoned arrows and broke Prometheus's chains, freeing him after an imprisonment that had lasted, depending on which version of the myth you consult, either 30 years or 30,000. Prometheus, grateful beyond any expression of gratitude available to him, told Hercules something crucial. Do not go to the garden yourself. Find Atlas. Atlas was the Titan who held the sky on his shoulders. He stood at the western edge of the world, his feet on the earth, and the vault of heaven pressing down on his back. And he had been standing there since the gods defeated the Titans in the war at the beginning of time. His daughters were the Hesperides. He knew the garden, and he could go there in a way that Hercules could not, because the serpent Ladon would not attack the father of the nymphs who tended the tree. Hercules found Atlas and made him a proposition. He would take the weight of the sky onto his own shoulders if Atlas would go to the garden and retrieve 3 apples. Atlas, who had been holding up the sky since before human memory began, agreed with what was probably unseemly speed. Hercules took the sky. And here the myth gives us one of its most quietly profound images. The strongest man in the world, the hero who has killed lions and hydras and giants and 3-bodied monsters, standing at the edge of the world with the entire weight of the heavens pressing down on him, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to do anything except hold on and wait and trust that the person he has sent on his behalf will come back. It is a labor of a completely different kind. Not strength against a monster, endurance of an impossible stillness. Atlas came back with the apples, and then he made the announcement that anyone who had been paying attention might have seen coming. He had decided not to give the sky back. He would deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself, and Hercules could just keep holding the heavens indefinitely. He seemed to think this was a reasonable position. Hercules thought quickly. He agreed.
He just needed Atlas to take the weight back for one moment, he said, so he could adjust his cloak and make a pad for his shoulders to sit more comfortably under the load. Atlas, apparently forgetting that he was dealing with the wiliest man alive after Odysseus, took the sky back. Hercules picked up the apples and walked away. The naturalistic interpretation of this labor requires a different approach than the ones we have been using. Because the garden of the Hesperides is not a real place, in the way that Lake Stymphalis or the Lerna swamp or Erythia are real places, it is deliberately, consciously located beyond the real world. And yet the ancient Greeks connected it to real geography. Some ancient sources place the garden in North Africa, in the region of modern Libya or Morocco. Others placed it in the Canary Islands, the archipelago off the northwest coast of Africa that was known to ancient sailors as the Fortunate Isles, a real place that had accumulated mythological significance as a paradise at the edge of the world. Both locations are plausible as destinations for a real expedition into the unknown Western Atlantic. The golden apples are interesting from a botanical perspective. The ancient Greeks did not have oranges. Citrus fruit was unknown in the Mediterranean world in the Bronze Age.
When citrus fruits eventually arrived, probably from Persia and ultimately from further east, the first ones to reach Greece were likely large, golden, and extraordinarily beautiful by comparison with anything the Greeks had seen before. Some classical scholars have suggested that the golden apples of the Hesperides may be a memory of the first contact between the Greek world and citrus fruit, the astonishment of encountering something so golden and so perfect that it seemed literally divine, something that could only have come from a garden tended by goddesses at the edge of the world. The association of citrus with paradise and divine favor persists in a remarkable number of cultures across the Mediterranean and Middle East, and may reflect exactly this quality of overwhelming novelty that the first encounter with citrus produced. The serpent Ladon is in one sense simply another guardian monster in a tradition full of them. But the detail that it never sleeps is philosophically significant in a way that the myth does not explicitly develop, but that lingers. The serpent that never sleeps is the serpent that is always watching. It is consciousness without rest, attention without end. It is the thing that makes the apples truly inaccessible, not through violence, but through perpetual vigilance. You cannot wait for your moment, because there is no moment when the watching stops. The only solutions are to find a way in that the watcher does not recognize as a threat, which is what Atlas does as the father of the Hesperides, or to distract the watcher permanently, which Hercules does not do in this labor, but which Orpheus does in another myth, by playing music so beautiful that Ladon finally closes its eyes. The exchange with Atlas is one of the great moments of practical intelligence in the entire tradition. Hercules cannot fight his way to the apples, cannot shoot his way there, cannot drive them out with noise or fire or flood. He has to find the right person, make the right deal, And then, when that deal is betrayed, think fast enough to recover the situation through cleverness rather than force. The trick he plays on Atlas, the request to just hold the sky for a moment while I get comfortable, is so simple and so obvious in retrospect that it is almost funny. And yet Atlas falls for it completely, which says something about the nature of long imprisonment. Atlas has been holding the sky since the beginning of time. He wants so badly not to be holding it that when someone offers him a way out, he takes it without thinking carefully enough about the terms. Desperation makes you credulous. It makes you see what you want to see rather than what is actually there. Prometheus's liberation is woven into this labor, and it deserves a moment of attention on its own. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. For this he was punished with eternal torment, chained to a rock while an eagle ate his liver day after day. The myth of Prometheus is one of the oldest and most resonant in the entire Greek tradition. It is a story about the cost of knowledge, about what happens when someone decides that humanity deserves something that the powerful have decided to withhold. And Hercules, passing by on his way to the end of the world, stops and frees him. With a poisoned arrow and brute force, yes, but the act itself is one of liberation. One hero freeing another. One person who has suffered unjustly, recognized and released by another person who understands suffering. The apples went to Eurystheus, and then, in most versions of the myth, Athena took them back. Because the golden apples of the Hesperides could not remain in the human world, they belonged to the garden. They belonged to Hera. They had to go back. Which makes the entire labor, the journey to the edge of existence, the weight of the sky on human shoulders, the trick played on a Titan, all of it, ultimately, transient. The apples were retrieved and then returned. What Hercules kept was not the apples, but the knowledge that he had reached a place nobody else had reached, and come back from it carrying something real. The proof of the journey. The memory of what the sky felt like pressing down on his shoulders at the end of the world while he waited for a Titan to come back with 3 pieces of fruit. The 12th labor is the last one, and it is the one that goes further than any of the others. Not further west, not further north, not to any distant island or mountain or swamp or garden at the edge of the world. It goes down, beneath the world entirely, into the place the Greeks called Hades, the realm of the dead, the underworld that existed below the surface of the living earth, and that no living person had ever entered and returned from. Except for a handful of exceptions in the mythological tradition, Orpheus descending to retrieve Eurydice, Odysseus traveling to the edge of it to consult the dead, and now Hercules, sent by Eurystheus with the most impossible instruction yet. Go to the land of the dead. Find the 3-headed dog that guards its entrance. Bring it back, alive. without weapons. The dog's name was Cerberus, and like several of the creatures Hercules had faced, Cerberus was a member of a monstrous family. His father was Typhon, the most terrible of all monsters in Greek mythology, a being so frightening that the gods themselves had fled from him. His mother was Echidna, half woman and half serpent, who had also produced the Hydra and Orthrus and the Nemean lion and the Sphinx. Cerberus himself was enormous, black, with 3 heads, a serpent for a tail, and a mane of living snakes around each of his necks. His function was specific and absolute. He welcomed the dead as they entered Hades. He prevented the living from entering, and he prevented the dead from leaving. He was the boundary made flesh, the irreversibility of death given a body and teeth and 3 sets of eyes that never looked away from the entrance to the underworld. Hercules prepared for this labor in a way he had not prepared for any of the others. He traveled to Eleusis, near Athens, and was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, the secret religious rites that were the most sacred in all of ancient Greece. The mysteries were associated with Demeter and Persephone, the goddesses of the grain and the underworld respectively, and they promised initiates a better experience after death, a kind of privileged passage through the underworld that ordinary souls did not receive. Exactly what happened during initiation was a secret so well kept that we still do not fully know it today, despite centuries of scholarly investigation. But the fact that Hercules sought this initiation before descending to the underworld tells us something important about how the ancient Greeks understood this labor. He was not just going somewhere dangerous. He was going somewhere that required a different kind of preparation entirely. Not physical training, spiritual preparation. He descended through one of the entrances to the underworld. Most versions of the myth specify the cave at Tenarum, a real place at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, the southernmost point of mainland Greece, where a cave descends into darkness, and where the ancient Greeks believed the boundary between the living world and the dead world was thinnest. He went down into the dark. In the underworld, he encountered the dead. He saw Meleager, a hero who had died young and promised to marry his sister, Deianira, when he returned to the living world, a promise that would eventually contribute to his death. He saw Medusa and drew his sword before Hermes reminded him that Medusa was dead and her shade could not harm him. He saw the shade of his friend Theseus, trapped in the underworld for attempting to kidnap Persephone, and freed him by pulling him up by the hand, though in some versions Theseus was stuck so thoroughly that pulling him free left some of his flesh behind, which is the mythological explanation for why Athenians supposedly had flat or thin buttocks. He encountered Ascalaphus, who had been buried under a boulder by Demeter, and rolled the boulder away, freeing him. He drank the blood of a sacrificed ox to give himself strength for the encounter with Cerberus. Then he went to Hades and Persephone themselves, and asked permission to take Cerberus. This is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire labor cycle. Hercules, who has killed or overpowered virtually everything he has faced in the previous 11 labors, does not attempt to fight the rulers of the underworld. He asks. He makes his case. He explains the compulsion of his situation, the labors imposed upon him, the need to complete this final task. And Hades, the god of the dead, agrees. On one condition. Hercules must subdue Cerberus without weapons, using only his hands. Hercules found Cerberus at the entrance to the underworld and did what he had done with the Nemean lion at the very beginning of his labors. He grabbed the dog around its necks and held on. Cerberus fought. The serpent tail struck and bit him. The mane of snakes bit at his arms and hands. But Hercules was wearing the skin of the Nemean lion, whose impenetrable hide protected him from the serpent bites, and he held on until Cerberus submitted. Then he led the dog through the underworld and up into the living world, and carried it to Eurystheus. Eurystheus, consistent with his behavior throughout the labors, was terrified. He hid in his bronze jar again. He told Hercules to take the dog back immediately. Hercules returned to the underworld, returned Cerberus to his post at the entrance, and the 12th labor was complete. The historical and philosophical reading of this final labor is necessarily different from the readings of the others. You cannot naturalize the underworld the way you can naturalize a swamp or a boar or a flock of aggressive birds. The land of the dead is not a real place, in the same sense that Lerna is a real place. And yet, the ancient Greeks treated the entrance at Tainarum as a real location. They built a sanctuary there. People traveled to it. The cave at the southern tip of the Peloponnese was a real cave that descended into real darkness, and that the real ancient Greeks genuinely believed was a point of contact between the living and the dead. Some scholars have interpreted the 12th labor as representing a real practice, the descent into caves or underground spaces as part of religious ritual. The ancient world had extensive traditions of katabasis, the ritual descent, in which priests or initiates entered underground spaces, real caves or man-made chambers, as a symbolic death and rebirth. The Eleusinian mysteries that Hercules was initiated into before his descent almost certainly involved some form of this symbolism. The initiate went symbolically into the world of the dead and came back transformed, which is exactly what Hercules does. He descends into death, navigates it, retrieves something from its deepest point, and returns to the living world. The labor is not just the last of 12 tasks. It is a death and a resurrection. The hero who began his labors by killing a lion now ends them by walking into death itself and walking back out again. Cerberus, as a real animal, has attracted naturalistic interpretation, despite the obvious difficulties. 3-headed dogs are not real, but large, fierce dogs guarding important locations are extremely real and extremely ancient. Dogs have been used as guardians since the earliest human settlements. The specific use of dogs to guard sacred or dangerous places, temples, tombs, treasuries, was widespread in the ancient world. A very large, very fierce dog, or dogs, guarding the entrance to a sacred cave, a cave that was genuinely believed to be an entrance to the underworld, would have been a real obstacle to any uninitiated person trying to enter. The 3 heads may be a mythological multiplication of real ferocity, the way that dangerous things in the ancient imagination always grew larger and more numerous with retelling. The serpent mane may reflect the real association between snakes and the underworld. Snakes living in the earth, emerging from cracks in the rock, associated with the chthonic, the below world, in Greek religious thinking. But I think the more important reading of the 12th labor is not naturalistic. It is structural. Because the 12 labors taken together form a complete arc. They begin with the most straightforward possible test of Hercules' most famous quality, his strength. And they end with something that strength alone cannot accomplish. You cannot fight your way into the underworld. You cannot strangle death. You cannot use your poisoned arrows on Hades. The final labor requires everything that the previous 11 have built. The physical endurance and strength from the first labor, the ingenuity from the second, the patience from the third, the knowledge of terrain and creature from the fourth, the practical intelligence from the fifth, the tactical thinking from the sixth, the willingness to cross seas to foreign places from the seventh, the understanding of human evil from the eighth, the experience of diplomatic failure and its costs from the ninth, the willingness to travel to the furthest reaches of the world from the 10th, the ability to endure an impossible stillness and trust others to complete what you cannot complete alone from the 11th. All of it, accumulated across a lifetime of impossible tasks, converges in the final labor. And what does Hercules bring back from the land of the dead? Not wealth, not power, not divine favor. A dog. A monstrous, terrifying, 3-headed dog that he has to return almost immediately because the king he brought it to was too scared to look at it. The 12th labor ends not with triumph, but with a kind of cosmic anticlimax. The greatest journey any human being in the Greek tradition has ever made, down into death itself and back. And the result is that a frightened king hides in a jar and tells you to put it back where you found it. Which is perhaps the most honest thing the myth says about the nature of heroism. That the reward is rarely proportional to the cost. That the person who does the impossible thing is not always recognized or celebrated in the moment. That you can walk into death and walk back out, and the man who sent you there will be hiding in a jar, too scared to even look at what you brought him. The labor was not for Eurystheus. It was never for Eurystheus. It was for the completion of something that had begun with a crime and a madness and a grief so total that it could only be addressed by doing the impossible, again and again, until the debt was paid. The debt was paid. 12 labors. Done. There is a question that sits underneath everything we have discussed tonight, and that I have been deliberately saving for the end. Not the question of whether the monsters were real, though we have spent considerable time on that. Not the question of whether Hercules himself was real, though that question is worth asking. But a deeper question. Why? Why did this story, specifically this story, survive? Why did it spread across the entire ancient Mediterranean world and embed itself so thoroughly in so many different cultures that it is still being told, in various forms, 3,000 years later? What is it about 12 labours performed by one man that resonated so deeply and so persistently that it outlasted the civilization that created it, outlasted the language it was first told in, outlasted the religion whose gods populated it, and arrived here, in the 21st century, still intact, still recognizable, still capable of meaning something to people who have never heard of Eurystheus or Hera or the Peloponnese? The answer, I think, has several layers, and each layer reveals something different about what human beings have always needed from their stories. The first layer is the simplest. Hercules did impossible things and survived them. This is the oldest and most universal appeal of the heroic narrative. We are drawn to people who face what would destroy us and come through it. Not because we expect to do the same things ourselves, but because the existence of such a person, even a legendary one, even a mythological one, expands our sense of what is possible. If one person can strangle a lion with bare hands, can navigate a swamp full of monsters, can hold the weight of the sky without being crushed, then the category of the possible is larger than we thought. And a larger category of the possible is, for human beings who live constrained and frightened and uncertain lives, an enormous psychological gift. But Hercules is not just strong. That is the thing that the popular image of him gets most wrong. He is not a simple strongman. He is a person of extraordinary and varied capability who grows across the course of his labours. The man who goes into the cave at Nemean to strangle a lion is not the same man who descends into the underworld to retrieve a 3-headed dog. He has been changed by everything that happened in between. The patience required by the Ceryneian Hind, the ingenuity required by the Augean stables, the endurance required by holding the sky at the edge of the world, all of these experiences have added something to him that raw strength alone could never provide. The labours are not just a list of achievements, they are an education, and the curriculum they represent is a remarkably complete one. Physical capability, intellectual flexibility, emotional endurance, moral complexity, the willingness to ask for help, the ability to trust others, the capacity to look at a problem from an angle that nobody else has tried. The second layer is darker and more honest. Hercules did not choose his labours. He was compelled to perform them as punishment for something he did in a moment of madness that was not entirely his own fault. Hera drove him mad. He killed his family while he was not himself, while his mind had been taken from him by divine intervention. And then, as if the act itself was not punishment enough, he was required to spend years performing impossible and dangerous tasks to atone for it. The injustice of this is visible and real, and the ancient Greeks did not try to paper over it. They let it stand. They made it central to the story. Hercules suffers for something that was done to him as much as something he did, and the labours are his response to that suffering, not denial, not bitterness, not collapse, but action, forward movement, the decision to do the next thing and the thing after that, even when the accumulation of difficulty and loss is almost unbearable. This resonates because it is true to a kind of human experience that is extremely common and almost never adequately represented in the stories we tell. The experience of being required to carry something that you did not entirely choose, of having to perform again and again in circumstances you did not create, for rewards that are often inadequate, and for judges who are often unworthy. Eurystheus is a small and frightened man. He hides in jars. He changes the rules when Hercules succeeds too well. He disqualifies labours on technicalities. He is pettiness and cowardice given a crown. And yet Hercules serves him, not because Eurystheus deserves it, but because the oracle said this was the path, and because the alternative was a guilt that would have consumed him entirely. The labours are not performed for Eurystheus. They are performed for Hercules himself, for his own survival, for his own integration of something unbearable into something livable. The third layer is geographical. The labours map the known world. They take Hercules to every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond, to the far west and the far north, and down into the earth itself. And everywhere he goes, he leaves a mark. A city founded, a strait named, a local tyrant defeated, a people freed from a predator or a disease or a political oppression. The labours of Hercules are not just a personal story. They are a story about the expansion of the human world, about the slow, violent, costly process by which civilization pushes into wilderness and makes it habitable. Every monster Hercules kills is a place that was inaccessible before and accessible after. Every creature he removes from a landscape makes that landscape safer for the people who will come after him. He is not just a hero. He is a force of civilization itself, moving through the wild world and leaving it changed. This is why the Greeks planted his name everywhere. The Pillars of Hercules at Gibraltar, the city of Abdera in Thrace, the founding myths scattered along the coast of Italy and France and Spain. These were not just stories. They were a way of asserting connection, of saying that this place, even this distant and unfamiliar place, had been touched by someone we know and claimed as part of the world we understand. Hercules was the Greek world's way of making the unfamiliar familiar, of drawing the edges of the map inward and saying, this is not beyond us. One of ours has been here, has faced what was here, and has come back to tell the story. The fourth layer is the one that I find most moving and most true. Hercules was not happy. He was not at peace. He was not, at the end of his labours, rewarded with a quiet life of prosperity and contentment. His story, after the 12 labours, is full of further suffering, further tragedy, further violence that he did not intend and could not entirely prevent. He was eventually killed by the poisoned blood of one of his own enemies, administered by the wife who loved him and who had been tricked into thinking it was a love charm. He died in agony on a funeral pyre that he built himself and climbed onto himself because the pain was too great to endure any other way. And then, in the tradition that followed him into death, he was taken to Olympus and made a god, the only mortal in the Greek tradition to achieve full divinity through his own effort and suffering. But even that apotheosis, that transformation into a god, is complicated. Because in the underworld, in the land of the dead that Hercules visited on his 12th labour, there was already a shade of Hercules, a shadow self that remained among the dead even as the divine Hercules ascended to Olympus. He existed in 2 places simultaneously after death, among the gods and among the dead, fully neither and fully both. It is the strangest and most resonant detail in the entire tradition, and Homer mentions it almost in passing, as if it were a fact so well known that it required no explanation. The hero who walked into death and came back still left something of himself there. The part of him that suffered, the part that was human, the part that killed his children in madness and carried that grief through 12 impossible labours and came out the other side, transformed, but not healed, never entirely healed. Because some things do not heal. They just become part of the landscape of who you are. Whether Hercules was a real person is a question that historians and archaeologists have debated for centuries without reaching a definitive answer. There was almost certainly someone, or several someones, at the root of the tradition, a Bronze Age warrior or warlord of extraordinary capability, whose deeds accumulated over generations of retelling into something superhuman. The specific details that feel most real, the 2-entrance cave at Nemean, the lake at Lerna, the city of Abdera, the pillars of Gibraltar, the initiation at Eleusis before the descent. These are the kinds of details that survive because they were true. The kind of details that get added to a story only when they actually happened. But whether the real person behind the myth was one man or many, whether his name was actually Hercules or something else entirely, whether he lived in the late Bronze Age or earlier or later, none of that changes the essential truth of what the story says, which is this: the world is full of things that will destroy you. Some of them are animals, and some of them are landscapes, and some of them are other people, and some of them are inside you. The darkness that Hera planted in Hercules before he was born, the capacity for violence that he carried alongside his capacity for greatness. The labours do not eliminate that darkness. They do not cure it or redeem it or make it disappear. What they do is give it somewhere to go. They turn destruction into creation. They take the force that killed a family in madness and redirect it over 12 labours and countless years
toward something that makes the world more livable for everyone who comes after. That is not a myth. That is not a fairy tale. That is a description of something real and difficult and genuinely human. The decision made over and over in circumstances that do not invite it and do not reward it adequately. To keep going, to do the next thing, to face the next labor, not because you are sure you will survive it, but because the alternative is to stop. And stopping is the one thing you cannot do. Hercules did not stop. 12 times he went where no sane person would follow, and 12 times he came back. Not unchanged, not unscathed, not healed, but back, carrying whatever the labor had given him, the lion skin, the poisoned arrows, the knowledge of what the sky weighs when it presses down on human shoulders at the edge of the world. He came back. And that, in the end, is the whole story. That is why we are still telling it 3,000 years later, in the dark, in the quiet, at the end of a long day, when the world feels too large and too dangerous, and too full of things that have no intention of making themselves easier to face. Because somewhere in the oldest part of the human imagination, there is a man in a lion skin, standing at the entrance to a cave or a swamp or a land of the dead. And he is afraid, and he goes in anyway, and he comes back. Good night.